You're listening to Politics Unspun with me, Jack McCluskey.
And me, Charlie Carter.
We're two economists discussing the hottest political debates.
Like, do tax cuts really boost economic growth?
How high should the minimum wage be?
Is Scotland ready for independence?
Should post-work pints be free?
Yes. And because there's nothing we love more than the sound of our own voices, we're putting our future career prospects on the line to share our thoughts on each one of these deliciously controversial topics.
We hope you enjoy. Hello, you alright?
How you doing, mate?
I'm very good. I've actually just played a game of golf, Charlie. I know that you've been toiling away at work.
Oh, have you? Oh, what'd you shoot?
Oh god, it didn't go that well. We were just doing the pitch and putt, so obviously it should be par threes, but
and you shot
I think
I
hit one par.
No, well, it's good to see you. So we're talking about the minimum wage today. Looking forward to it.
Yeah, me too. Actually.
Absolutely. Yeah, no. So we've just been sort of talking about this a little bit off air, if you like. And we've sort of just been talking about just how interesting of a topic this is, right? And we're sort of just fundamentally saying that there's such a discrepancy between current economic theory and the empirical evidence.
Yeah. I think, if anything, that's sort of kept me away from it because I'm like, oh, I don't want to open that can of worms.
We sort of do these on a Wednesday, Thursday, and I only looked at this a couple of days ago. So
yeah, but you know this topic inside and out, really.
Yeah. So this was essentially one of my ideas for my PhD. This was my original proposal. So this is actually the money I'm being paid to do is on the minimum wage. So don't tell anyone that I've sort of changed.
Well, this could be your evidence, can't it?
Yeah. The minimum wage. So this is obviously one of the longest standing debates in economics. Debate dates all the way back to the 19th century, I believe, in old New Zealand, Australia. It's a policy that's been part of shaping the classical versus interventionist, left versus right political debate for the last century. It's way more complex than people give it credit for. And it's also an example of where economics falls massively short and provides insights into where our understanding of economic models and economic understanding in general needs to improve. So, Jack, do you want to do a little bit of the modern history? What is a minimum wage and where are we?
I will do, but first you just said that economics falls short and you're in this area, so really it's you to blame.
I am,
really,
absolutely.
You've not met the requirements.
The whole podcast is going to be like, don't know, mate. No idea.
No, I want a fixed number. By the end of this, I want you to tell me what you think the minimum wage should be.
I think my signal might cut out before that.
Right, okay, I'll get back to the point.
I would love that. I really would love that. No.
So the minimum wage was introduced by New Labour in the UK in 1999, and the point of it, the purpose, was to reduce both absolute and relative poverty. So that's to improve living standards and reduce inequality. And it was one of their flagship policies following, 17 years of Conservatives. I mean, people are moaning about 14 years now, but they had Thatcher, was it twice or three times, and then John Major. And during that period, inequality had increased dramatically, especially in the late 80s. If you look at the Gini index, which is what the economists use to measure inequality, it really sort of jumped up during that last 5 years of the 80s and then sort of plateaued again. And it was synonymous with clamping down on these unions, which had been sort of setting sectoral minimum wages. And by clamping them down, you can sort of see why Labour felt like we needed a national minimum wage that went across all sectors. And this was initially opposed by the Conservatives, but they seem to sort of, I don't know if your opinion on this, but they seem to have come round to the idea that minimum wages are correct. They introduced the national living wage, which was 50p above the minimum wage at the time in 2016. And now we're looking at a minimum wage for people 21 years old and over of £11.44, moving down to £8.60 for people between 18 and 20, and then £6.40 for people under 18 or apprentices. So when it was introduced, it was originally around 45% of the median hourly salary. Now it's around 60%, and the Low Pay Commission, which was set up by Blair, advise now 67%.
Yeah, so just jumping on it, I remember you saying about the Conservatives come around to the minimum wage. I think it's really interesting. I was listening to Alistair Campbell recently, everyone's favourite spin doctor, and he was saying about how one of the most influential parts of the New Labour era and one of the most defining parts of the New Labour era was, one, the introduction of minimum wage and central bank independence. They've sort of become standard in the political discourse. I think it's really interesting. So I just wanted to take us a little...
That's a pretty good point.
Yeah, it was really interesting. So I just wanted to take us a little bit back to sort of the ancient history of the minimum wage, because this is really, I think, what makes a lot of it interesting. So stick with me, or just skip 30 seconds ahead. So the minimum wage was introduced in Australia and New Zealand back in the late 19th century, so like 1890s, don't ask me for a specific date, but around then. And ever since then, it's been really, really controversial. Obviously, the proponents are saying, well, having a higher minimum wage can reduce poverty, reduce inequality, and essentially bridge the gap between the richest and poorest, as Jack was just saying. But a lot of economists back in the day were very much in favor of this idea of free markets and perfect competition, and perfectly what we call frictionless markets, meaning that just markets work essentially perfectly. And the idea was that if in a frictionless world, if you imposed a minimum wage that is above someone's productivity, then why would a firm hire them? So by imposing a minimum wage, you're actually hurting the people you were supposed to be helping and essentially pricing low wage workers out of the market. And this sort of argument developed and had a lot of strength through the 1940s and up until the 1960s, where human capital theory became a thing, and essentially this idea that wages are a reflection of skills, so why would you introduce a minimum wage? And right up until the 90s, this was a massive part of it. And in the 90s, when economists started to develop this idea of frictions and markets aren't necessarily perfect, this idea of search frictions, imperfect information, all this stuff, there actually became a lot of credence for the minimum wage. And there was actually a really interesting article that called anyone who's in support of the minimum wage in the 90s politically correct, Jack. And it was a bit of a vehement backlash on economists for suggesting that the minimum wage might be a good policy. And right up until now, it's still highly controversial, especially in America. And it's really, really interesting.
Yeah, so if I can jump in there with my very basic, naive understanding of A-level economics. So Charlie's going to strip me apart after I say this, but one of the models that explains why the minimum wage might not actually cause unemployment or reduce employment is this idea of monopsony power. These companies that are sort of the single employer in a certain either area or just generally. And the idea that when they've got this power, it's basically not a competitive market. And you can get a case where they're underemploying their staff. And in these models, I won't go into the technical detail of it, but actually a minimum wage set to the right level could actually increase employment because of how it affects the incentives of the employer. But you've got some suggestion that's not the perfect model, right?
That's really interesting. No, you put it beautifully. But it's there's this theoretical standoff between this idea of perfect versus imperfect competition. And empirically, what we see is very, very interesting. Obviously, this perfectly competitive world, we actually see that in the statistics that higher minimum wages don't lead to any employment effects. So that would naturally lean more towards this idea of monopsony. But then what makes this subject so annoying is that there isn't a huge amount of evidence for monopsony either. And I will admit the evidence on this is quite weak. I don't think the literature is particularly strong. But basically, the evidence suggests that monopsony power isn't a massive thing. And you can make arguments that this isn't true because of the existence of self-imposed job mobility decisions or because of geography or whatever. But fundamentally, a lot of experts in this field believe that there's not much evidence for monopsony power. And this sort of turns to, okay, so how do we reconcile all of these conflicting ideas? And I think the way we're going to sort of think about this is when a firm is hit with a minimum wage, what do they do? How do they react? And I just wanted to go through a few of the adjustment mechanisms that firms have available to them, Jack, when they're hit with a minimum wage. And I just want you to sort of give a rough idea of and your thoughts on what you think the most important might be. So the first is non-compliance, this idea that even if the minimum wage is introduced, firms just might not pay it. They might just say F you and just continue to pay what they were paying before.
I think we can wipe that one out. Well, I don't think that's going to be the thing.
One that I was particularly interested in for my PhD originally was this idea of non-pecuniary adjustment. So this is basically like you're not just affecting the wage, but instead you're going to reduce the amount of training or the amount of free meals they have or reduce their pension or whatever. And these things that aren't in the wage but do cost the firm some money. So that's one of them. The third one is the firm is just going to increase their prices. So if the minimum wage increases, then McDonald's Big Macs are going to cost a couple of quid more. The fourth one is that firms are essentially going to use the minimum wage to increase their productivity in the firm. They're going to be like, oh shit, we've had this higher cost. We're going to have to get our workers to work a little bit more productively. So that's the fourth one. There's also one whereby, higher minimum wage might mean that firms essentially pass that through onto suppliers. So if a firm was a monopsonist, they might go, oh, well, we're going to reduce our cost. We have a higher cost of labor, but we'll reduce our cost on other inputs like fuel and things like that, and other rent and everything like that. And the last one is, I'm just getting these points all mixed up. But anyway, the last one is that there's just a reduction in profit and that the firms entirely absorb it. So just to recap, you have non-compliance, non-pecuniary adjustment, increase in prices, increasing productivity, pass through to suppliers, and a reduction in profit. So what do you think are the most important, Jack, in the empirics?
Is the whole point of this section to make me look like an idiot? Because it's going to work.
You don't need any help with that, Jack. No.
Listen to those. I feel like just from a theoretical stance, I would hit back at all of them. I don't see one as the solution. Personally, I'll tell you what I think on each of them. It may take some time.
No, that's fine.
But, so the first one, non-compliance. I think most of these companies are fairly big companies. I don't think they would get away with non-compliance. So I would strip that for most employers.
Apart from OG 2015 Sports Direct. I think that
they found ways, didn't they?
Yeah.
The non-pecuniary benefit, I would guess that these companies are usually stripping pecuniary benefits down to the bone anyway. So, and given that low-paid people would mostly be interested in the wage, they would have an incentive to, rather than increase pecuniary benefits, they would increase the wage. So I don't think that should have an impact. They should already be pretty low. The price thing, theoretically, they wouldn't be able to pass all the price on, right? The consumers can't be perfectly, inelastic, right?
Yeah.
What's the next one?
The next one was pass through to suppliers.
Pass through. I couldn't tell you about that one. But I guess the same sort of thing applies, right?
If you were to assume that firms are monopolies, then you monopsonists, you might argue that they don't just have control over labor, but they also have control over capital and fuels and things. So that's a really interesting one for testing imperfect
really
competition. Yeah.
Okay, so we'll hold that to the side as one that I don't know about, but sounds like it could be promising.
Okay.
And then what was the
last one is that they just absorb all of it, and it's just they reduce their profits. So sort of the opposite of increase in prices. It's like the firm owner takes the hit.
Theoretically, I feel like that's the one that fits best. The original, the A-level argument of a monopsony, that should fit most. So if I had to put my finger on it, I would say partially increasing prices, but nowhere near like just passing it all through, absorbed it into profits, and then that supplier thing, I don't know how it works, but it sounds like it's important. How wrong am I?
No, did we do the increasing productivity as well? Did we do that one? Or did I just miss it?
The productivity one.
How much do you think that workers...
That just sounds like they're being suboptimal, and that doesn't make sense. Like, surely these business people know what they're doing, so I would disregard that one. But how wrong am I? How many out of?
Well, no, I think you've given.
I
think you've done a really good job of highlighting why this is such a crazy policy. Well, there's such a not a crazy policy, but a crazy debate, and how as many inconsistencies there are. So, the perfect competition model would predict that there would be non-pecuniary adjustment, there'd be increases in prices, and that you might get some reduction in profit. That's sort of like not the reduction in profit one, but you would get this increase in prices and non-pecuniary benefit adjustment. The monopolistic model would suggest that you'd get pass-through to the suppliers, some level of non-compliance, and a reduction in profit. And we just have a mismatch of all of these. Okay, so so this is actually relatively simple. Most evidence is that there's an increase in prices and increase in productivity, eking out productivity gains from workers.
Productivity one?
Yeah. So
that doesn't make sense to me.
Some estimates by Jube and Linda, who are sort of like the rock stars of minimum wage theory, given that we're on the whole rock stars identification thing, about 80% of the production cost is recuperated by increasing the prices. And this would essentially imply a relatively inelastic demand, meaning that when prices change, consumers don't really change their consumption behavior, which would imply that we're sort of dealing with monopolies, right? Firms that have some level of price setting power. And we're also seeing that there's a lot of eking out of these productivity gains, which also implies, like you said, that firms aren't optimizing, which also implies some level of imperfect competition because there's some level of inefficiency there where firms essentially don't care about optimizing, which makes this such a difficult thing. But the increase in prices is also not really consistent with, is only really explained by the perfect competition model. So it all gets very jarred. And the weirdest one is that we don't see a reduction in profit. So we don't see a reduction in profit.
Now you're really messing with my mind.
Which implies a perfectly competitive world, even though all the other ones imply that there's a imperfect world. So the whole thing just gets crazy. And I think the institutional economists back in the last century did this the most justice. And instead of dealing with all this mathematical and theoretical BS, do you know what they did, Jack? They just went and asked people.
Oh no!
So I think before
really,
we were
really
just
bad.
we're just talking about, you know, all these economists sat in the dark room doing all their modelling, and these people just went, you know what? The people with the highest number of social skills just went, you know, fuck this. we're just going to go ask people. And so what they did is they say? Well, so they said what we see in the evidence. We see that they said that an increase in the minimum wage, they wouldn't adjust their employment behavior, they wouldn't adjust the level of employment. They said they would try to eke out productivity gains where they could. They'd probably increase prices, and their profit wouldn't take a hit. So all of these theoretical models that we're trying to use to predict this were very much just expected by institutional economists. And just, I'm going to use this opportunity to highlight some of the arrogance and sort of pretentiousness of economists sometimes who suffer with physics envy. Institutional economists were very much disliked by these classical, theoretical economists who sort of thought about the art and the maths behind economics. And this is what happened essentially during the 20th century. And neoclassical economists of the time, especially Friedman, disliked them very, very much because he likened business leaders to baseball players who couldn't tell you the physics behind hitting a home run. So his argument was that business leaders couldn't tell you the economics of running their own firm, which seems a little bit backwards to me. Maybe I haven't done Friedman argument justice, but basically all I'm saying is that it's a very complicated topic and we don't really understand it theoretically. Isn't that crazy?
That's just nuts to me, Charlie. I love the idea that they did just ask these people and then all the academia decided, shall we listen to this or shall we just carry on with our models saying, no, they're wrong. Yeah, they wouldn't do that.
Well, then we'd have to get rid of the dark room. And then we couldn't. then we'd have to go and speak to people.
Yeah, but why would they do those things? I'm really confused. Why would they not change their employment patterns? When you ask them, why wouldn't their first thing be like, oh no, I'll just sack some people?
Well, this gets really interesting. Is that I think there's some, and something that we don't really get into the modelling of, but I think there's some really interesting dynamic effects here. That if firms aren't 100% sure of what is exactly optimal in their own decision making, then it might be the case that the introduction of a minimum wage essentially points to firms being able to reduce inefficiency within their own firms. So they'll say, you know, we realize there's some inefficiencies here. We'll try and eke out those productivity gains to make up for the minimum wage. And maybe that's just in an anticipation of, you know, they don't have all the information like you would in a frictionless economic model. And I think there's maybe an expectation of firms that they go, oh, well, we don't fully know exactly where we're optimizing, but we're going to try find out. We're going to use this as an opportunity to really streamline our business. So that's one effect. Also, if they have the option of raising prices, then because they have some level of market power, then that is preferable to laying off workers. Because if you can keep a steady workforce, then that's preferable. And this actually goes back to one of the other adjustment mechanisms that I was speaking about earlier, which is a reduction in staff turnover. If you have a higher minimum wage, people don't want to move as often, and also firms don't want to have a higher cost of rehiring and retraining. So you actually get a lower staff turnover, which might imply lower efficiency. That is one of the side effects of minimum wage, possibly. But if you have a firm that goes, well, I'm going to have a lower turnover anyway of staff, I might as well just keep the worker I have at the moment and try eke productivity gains out of them and also simultaneously increase the prices.
Yeah. So does this all contribute to that classic idea of sort of efficiency wages, that you would pay people more and then you would only get the best staff applying? So So for those that don't know, efficiency wages is this theory in economics where if you pay people more money, they're essentially incentivized to work harder. And the problem with current economic modeling in the labor world is that in search models, we don't have really efficiency wage elements. And all of this points to a situation where firms aren't optimizing. They exist in very imperfectly competitive worlds. And that's not currently captured by economic theory. You know, in economic theory, we always assume that individuals know what's best for them. We know what they're optimizing. We know what their decision is. And this all points to a situation where firms don't know what's best. And that's not being incorporated in the current economic modeling. And it's a very complex problem that
economists need to try and deal with, this level of uncertainty over individuals' own optimizing behavior, because that sort of hits right to the core of what we do as economists, and that's something I don't really know how you deal with.
I mean, this is really going to hurt the egos of, we're talking free market economists, if we're saying that the government should introduce a minimum wage because these employers don't realise they should be setting a higher minimum wage, is you know, that they don't realise what's best for them almost, is that really hits the heart of free market.
And I think one of the themes we're coming across in this podcast just pretty consistently is that policies are more complex than we just exist in a world where markets operate perfectly all the time. You know, there's in this example, you've got efficiency wage elements, you've got to consider staff turnover, you've got to consider imperfect competition, you've got to consider imperfect information and search frictions and all of these things that obscure that sort of perfect world whereby, higher wages price people out the market. It's not quite as simple as that. And I think that's sort of what we're trying to get across, and it's why it's been such an interesting topic for this podcast, right?
It's getting so confusing to me. How do you feel about this, though, Charlie, that when the theory gets this tough, I mean, we're talking... labour markets anyway, it's sort of in the bridge between microeconomics, so just firm level, individual level, and then macro, which is the whole picture. And we can talk about this another time, but macro models are they're incomplete, to say the least. So it seems like there's so much challenge in making the theoretical model. So is there just a benefit just to moving to purely empirical based stuff?
Well, I am very much in favour of empirical work. I think this is quite a complex answer, and we definitely should go more into it when we talk about economic modelling as a podcast episode. But I think they all serve different purposes. Empirical evidence tells us what's actually happening, which is great. But we do need a theory as to why it's happening, because we can't sort of just sit back idly and go, we know what's actually happening. Because if there is an event where we need the knowledge that the theory would give us, then it would have been irresponsible not to look for that theory in the first place, sort of thing. So we need to have an understanding about how the labour market works, because the empirical evidence is currently suggesting we don't have an understanding of why this really happens. In completion, we've got a rough idea, but not in completion. And I think we need to use this as sort of a prompt to try and improve our economic modelling, so that when a situation or a policy or something else comes up, we have a better way of dealing with it. You know, it's like physicists who, I think I was listening to Neil deGrasse Tyson ramble on about the Higgs boson randomly earlier. And he was saying, not all innovations are immediately useful. And to a lesser extent, it is the same in economics. We need a theory which could in future become very useful for building a proper macroeconomic model, which I don't think we currently have. It might contribute to our understanding of microeconomics or game theory or something else that we didn't know about, or it might move to a whole different interpretation of how we model economies, moving away from certain optimizing behavior. There's endless possibilities. But my point is, we do need to understand how it happens. We can't just look at the actual result. We need a theory as the mechanisms behind it.
That makes sense to me. But then I almost feel until we've got that theory that actually is complex enough or intricate enough to explain that, when we're deciding what the minimum wage should be, that seems like it should be governed mostly at this stage by empirical research. I'm making this conclusion without an understanding.
No, you're right. No, absolutely. And currently, without an understanding of the mechanics behind it, when you're doing policy, in the meantime, it's sort of like a plaster on the broken arm solution. You sort of do need to just look at what actually happens. And I think it's difficult to calibrate an optimal minimum wage because we don't have an optimal theory. But I think because there's very little employment effect, we know that for sure. And we know that there is a very positive effect on poverty reduction and inequality reduction. As long as the minimum wage isn't outlandishly high, then I think there's some very strong policy evidence for incorporating it.
So like I was saying earlier, the Low Pay Commission is suggesting 67% of median wage when it's currently 60%. And I think their argument behind that is, I looked at some other literature as well, very briefly, but that employment effects don't come into play, like as in reducing employment and causing unemployment, don't come into play until you're past 70% of the median wage. That seems to be the suggestion.
That seems to be what I've sort of come across as well,
Yeah, no, I find that really, really interesting. Is there anything more you want to get on this, this really heavy part before we move on to some fun bits?
I think I've done. This is heavy. I'll move on.
Well, can I just first say, Charlie, congratulations, because you've done a really good job of making me interested in this topic again. Because before I don't know. I thought I got a bit tired of the debate.
Can I just say that means that 100% of my audience on that ramble has now been inspired by it?
No, I think you did a really good way of. It's quite technical, isn't it? But at least for me, it was very digestible.
And I think this is one of the
feel like an expert.
One of the problems with talking about things that you know not to be, but with something you've studied quite a lot, is it's difficult to digest and articulate in a concise way when you sort of just want to blurt it all out, sort of thing. So I hope it made a little bit of sense. Yeah.
No, absolutely did. We can see how there's definitely a mismatch between the theory and the evidence, but also how you've got those two classic models that should be competing against each other, but actually the evidence seems to pick and choose which bits apply, and it gets so interesting. So I find that really cool. So quick fire round, sort of,
nice.
in terms of fun bits. I thought the first thing would be interesting is this idea of labour markets being more inflexible if you've got a minimum wage. So the argument that in bad macroeconomic states where we've got sort of either a recession or depression, that by stopping wages from being able to fall, you basically got this idea of sticky wages, which enhance a depression or recession. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so this is just I thought this could be interesting. I don't know how much evidence on literature there is on this. This is sort of just a hypothesis. So if anyone does ever listen to this and can send me something on it, it'd be really interesting. But basically, I would assume the idea is that if you have a minimum wage, that just means that firms can't adjust wages if they need to go down. Like, obviously, there's a lot of sticky wages in the economy anyway. You know, it's very difficult to lower someone's wage in the European country. Easier in America, but quite difficult in Europe. But the idea is essentially that if you had a perfectly flexible wage, then if a recession hit, then firms could adjust wages, and that would essentially dampen the negative economic effect that you feel in a recession. And this goes back to why macro models are not complete. We don't have a full understanding of it completely, but I'd put a lot of money on the idea that having higher minimum wages does reduce our ability to adapt to an economy. But, you know, it's a minor effect when we're considering the minimum wage, I think.
I think I agree with you on that, especially given that wages are considered to be sticky already. So it's almost like if they're already sticky, then adding this on top.
And this might go into we could do an episode on broader labour market flexibility, because, you know, in the US, you have very flexible, you know, you can fire someone for looking at you the wrong way to a degree.
And that's great.
Which, to be honest, I'm thinking about doing that. Although I'd be fired non-stop.
Yeah, I was going to say, Charlie.
I'll move out there when I've made a name for myself, you know. And then I'll start firing people. That's my goal. But in Europe, obviously, there's a lot more rigidity in labour laws. And it'd be interesting to think about the implications of that. Because I can see you're enthused by your face at the moment. But it would be really interesting. And it goes way deeper than it would be interesting. Yeah,
I think so. Because it's really clear in the data, when you look at like the 2008 crisis and things, that America's unemployment skyrocketed straight away. But then recovered so much quicker than everyone else.
Yeah.
And it's interesting. So you've got the con of it obviously skyrocketing in the first place, but then the benefit of it bouncing back.
Absolutely. And that goes,
that's really cool, I think. And then two other bits that I don't know if you're interested in. If you're not, move on. But I'm interested in the labour market distortions of, this is anecdotal, right? But my mum was talking about when you had supervisors only earning slightly more than just the general staff, maybe in a retail industry. As soon as you increase the minimum wage, you start reducing the disparity between the lowest and sort of the management level. And does it affect maybe it doesn't affect unemployment because that just looks at it on aggregate, but does it affect sort of which jobs people take up?
Interesting. So just on that, this was another mechanism that I was going to talk about, but didn't think I had time. So thanks for bringing it up. But there's this idea of high wage retrenchment, which is if you increase the minimum wage, do people reduce higher wages to sort of account for that cost? But actually what we see is that firms try to keep the markup between low skill and high skill jobs relatively constant. So if you have a higher minimum wage, that tends to push wages up to a degree higher up the pay ladder. And so the idea of that, would fundamentally be to maintain competitiveness relative to what low skilled workers are doing as well. So I don't think you should see too much of efficiency in the high wage labour market changing. I do think you see efficiency changes in the low skilled labour market because of this lower turnover as a result of the minimum wage, which I briefly touched on. Yeah, I think.
Okay, that's really interesting. Thanks for pointing that out. That it's a constant markup. That's cool.
Yeah, it's quite cool. I forget exactly where it tails off, but I think especially it's like the lower high skilled jobs. There's like a ladder effect. Yeah, if you one. Yeah.
So does that reinforce the idea that they would have to push up prices then to pay for this?
Yeah, I imagine so. Because that once you sort of start getting rid of all of these mechanisms, you're sort of really only left with, we have to increase prices or lose profit. And it just turns out that firms are imperfectly competitive enough to be able to increase prices. So, yeah.
Oh, God, it is interesting.
It's so weird, isn't it? So I know we have this sort of variable minimum wage in the UK for different ages. What do you think about that?
I think it's an interesting debate, not one that I'm prepared for, I think. But I like the idea that they have a lower minimum wage because it enables people to get sort of on the ladder almost, sort of gain the experience which first gets you through the door. But it's classic wage discrimination, right? I shouldn't be using terminology like that in a podcast, but there's not much economic value to it. Surely, I don't know.
Yeah, I'm not gonna. I know. I saw this in the show notes, if you like, but it's not one I've actually given a huge amount of thought. I mean, originally when I first heard it, when I hear most things, I just go, no, don't like it, because obviously the minimum wage is lower for apprentices, and for that it does make a little bit more sense to a degree. But then again, we need a mechanism. We need an understanding of how the low wage labour market works, because I'm sort of going into this in the dark, because if we without empirical evidence, we don't really know on these specific policy issues. If we had a framework, it'd be easier to tell. But I think theoretically, the idea would be if you have a lower minimum wage for apprentices, that encourages firm uptake of apprentice programs, which is positive for development of human capital in education and everything like that, which is positive for the economy. So, yeah, I'm tentatively in favour of age bracketed minimum wages, especially for apprentices. Also, especially as you don't want firms retracting non-wage benefits like training and education for lower wage people. But
yeah, I'm just aware that my friend used to be fuming that he felt that he was more productive than, let's call her Sarah or Sally, who was on the tills and was really, really slow, but she was on a higher wage than he was, and he was 18 at the time, so he was earning, at the time it was much lower, and he was just fuming because he was like, well, the productivity is the same, so we should be paid the same.
Yeah.
And I get that. But I do remember saying back to him, but you don't have any costs, really. You don't have like the rent that you're paying and things like that. So in terms of the purpose of the minimum wage anyway was to reduce relative inequality and absolute inequality.
Nothing poverty, like a cold-hearted economic explanation for someone's destitution.
Yeah, he didn't talk to me after that. I can't remember why, but...
Oh yeah, no. I mean, it is interesting, and that's something I want to think about a little bit more. Is people doing the same job at different stages of their life, they're being paid differently. I think the best way of reconciling that is that we do live in a dynamic labour market. So even if let's say someone's 50 and someone's 20, and they're doing the same job, and they're earning the 50-year-old's earning more than the 20-year-old, even though the 20-year-old's more productive. The argument essentially goes, if you're a lot more productive than the 50-year-old, that's probably quite a good indication that you'll, at their time in life, be earning more than them. So if you look at it that way, it's maybe easier to stomach, possibly. But in the moment, it's difficult.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's a thought, I don't know, debate that people can think about in their own time, I guess.
To be honest, I think this is one on the other episodes, we've really sort of, in some ways, had some conclusions. I think this one has just been a way of explaining how complicated this is, and that we don't... It's one of those you can't speak... It's like religion. You can't really speak with it on any certainty, because, But and that's been the goal of this, I think. But yeah.
Yeah. I like the idea that we've sort of picked people up at the sort of peak of the Dunning-Kruger curve and then sort of thrown them down to the bottom.
Isn't that
you don't know anything?
Isn't that the goal of this podcast, to make people feel worse about themselves?
Yeah. Everyone had so much certainty, and then we've just ruined it all.
I know. Everyone came in being like, so obvious that if you have a high minimum wage, you price people out. Yeah, well... Well, wow. No, but thanks, Jack.
Yeah.
This has been
Charlie, hats off to you. You suggested this topic, and I think it's been one of my favourites, actually, probably the favourite. So thanks for that.
Thank you.
I hope our listeners have enjoyed it.
Listener.
We'll see you next time.
See you next time. Bye.